What maniacs and killers say before being sentenced to death is not a revelation. Much more interesting is what happens to the bodies of these horrific individuals after the sentence is carried out. Some are simply cremated and secretly scattered over the sea, while some maniacs have their brains removed to find physical deviations in their disturbed minds. I'll tell you about these terrifying people and what happened to their bodies after execution. And at the end, I have a chilling story about a terrorist who killed 168 people all alone. His father, a stern man of Polish descent, and his mother, an Englishwoman with Danish roots, raised John along with his sisters Joanna and Karen in an atmosphere of fear and constant bickering. Later, Wayne became known as the Killer Clown, a sinister maniac who used his clown persona to lure and kill young boys. His first victim? 15-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy, he lured with the promise of free lodging and a Chicago tour. That was just the beginning of his gruesome path. However, Gacy was not just a killer, his crimes were particularly heinous and cruel. He murdered his victims by strangulation and suffocation while subjecting them to torture and violence. These acts of brutality led to 33 confirmed killings, and he concealed most of their bodies in the crawl spaces and basement of his home. I get chills just thinking about this monster. Over the years, his perverse inclinations took an even more sinister turn. He revealed certain things about his personality to his second wife, Carol Hoff. Shocked by his confessions, Carol noticed that John increasingly returned home in the early morning hours, bringing strangers and boys into the garage who never emerged from there. In 1976, unable to endure such a life, Carol took her daughters and left Gacy, divorcing him. The following years, from 1976 to 1978, became the most horrifying in Gacy's life. He referred to this period as his cruising years, when he, alone and unhinged, freely hunted his victims. His home turned into a trap for boys whom he brought in at any time of the day or night. Neighbors reported to the authorities how Gacy's car constantly left and returned at different times of the night. And of course, with such a body count, the killer was sentenced to death. Ask me, what was unusual about his execution? On the morning of May 9, 1994, before the execution, Gacy was transferred to the Stateville Correctional Center. There, he was allowed to have a final picnic with his family on the prison grounds. His last meal was quite peculiar: a bucket of KFC, French fries, fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and Diet Cola. It was the last indulgence he allowed himself before his death. During the execution, an unexpected problem arose. The chemicals used for injection solidified, clogging the tube. As a result, the execution team had to replace the tube, and the process took 18 minutes instead of the expected couple. This sparked criticism from anesthesiologists and led to a change in the lethal injection method in Illinois. Gacy never expressed remorse for his crimes until the end, but even more interesting is what they did with his body. After confirming his death, his brain was extracted for research, attempting to understand the psychology of such villains. Damn! The rest of the body was cremated with an empty head. Brr. But believe me, this is not the most shocking part of what I'll tell you today. And I'll continue with Victor Fegert, a native of Michigan, who in 1960 came to Dubuque, Iowa, and settled in a rundown boarding house. He went down in history as the last person executed in the United States before the death penalty moratorium and the last sentence to death in the state of Iowa. What particularly surprised me, Fegert was a vagabond and a drifter, and hardly anything is known about him, a mysterious man. One day, he started calling local doctors from the phone directory, claiming that a woman needed medical help. Why? It was a cunning plan to lure one of them. His victim was Dr. Edward Bartels, who responded to the cell, was abducted, and then killed by Fegert. The doctor's body was found in a cornfield in Illinois with a gunshot wound to the head. Fegert was arrested shortly after when he tried to sell the doctor's car in Alabama. The buyer, James B. Elford, sensed something amiss and reported to the FBI. Authorities believe Fegert kidnapped Dr. Bartels for access to medications that the doctor might have had. The charges against Fegert were serious, since he transported his captive across state lines, leading to a federal trial. In his defense, Fegert concocted a story about a drug addict from Chicago who supposedly actually killed Bartels. Fegert claimed to have killed this non-existent addict and disposed of his body in the Mississippi, but authorities found no evidence of this story. After the federal court found him guilty and sentenced him to death, Fegert attempted to appeal for clemency to President John F. Kennedy through his lawyer and Iowa Governor Harold Hughes. But Kennedy, convinced of the brutality of Fegert's crime, denied clemency, which doesn't surprise me at all considering the overwhelming evidence. Ask me what happened next? Victor Feger was transferred from the federal prison Leavenworth to the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, where he spent his last days before execution. He remained calm and composed, setting an example of exemplary inmate behavior. For his last meal, Feger requested just one olive with a pit, expressing hope that an olive tree would grow from it as a symbol of peace. On March 14, 1963, Feger spent the night in vigil with a Roman Catholic priest. The next morning on March 15, he was dressed in a new suit and taken to the execution site where he was hanged. Among the witnesses were journalists and even Iowa House Representative John Ely, for whom observing the execution became decisive in his fight against the death penalty in the state. After the execution, when Feger's body was taken to a local funeral home, an olive pit was found in one of the pockets of his suit, a final reminder of his peculiar yet peaceful gesture. Feger's death certificate indicated execution fracture of the cervical spine. His body was buried in an unmarked grave at the Fort Madison City Cemetery. As I understand it, no olive tree ever grew there. Now, let me tell you what happened to the body of the most charismatic American serial killer. Ted Bundy grew up in a family where his biological mother was considered his sister, and his grandparents were his parents. He exhibited strange behavior from a young age. For instance, I was struck by an incident where he placed kitchen knives around his sleeping aunt when he was only 3 years old. One of his early signs of peculiar behavior was his hobby of spying on people and digging through garbage bins. His teenage years were marked by social alienation and mockery from peers despite academic success. He claimed that socializing was stressful for him and that he didn't understand why people wanted to be friends with each other. The exact date of the start of his murders remain unknown, although the first proven murder was committed when Bundy was 27. Bundy left a bloody trail from Washington to Colorado, killing young women with particular brutality. He was arrested only in the summer of 1975, by which time he had committed at least 30 murders. Even after his arrest, his charm continued to influence women, many of whom attended court hearings to see him. During the trial, Bundy received a marriage proposal from Carol Ann Boone, whom he had dated in Washington. In 1982, they even had a daughter. On the eve of his execution, Bundy discussed the possibility of suicide, not wanting to give the state satisfaction from his death. Finally, on January 24, 1989, he was executed in the electric chair. A crowd gathered outside the prison to celebrate his death. After the execution, Bundy's remains were cremated and the ashes were scattered in the Cascade Mountains, according to his last will. Another criminal I must tell you about, Ronnie Lee Gardner, convicted of robbery and murder, left a dark mark on the history of criminology. His choice of execution method, firing squad, was determined by religious beliefs. As a Mormon, he believed that he could atone for his sins through someone else's blood. Gardner was sentenced to death for a series of crimes, including robbery and murder in Salt Lake City, and his execution was postponed for 25 years due to numerous appeals, ultimately leading to changes in Utah's legislation. His last days were marked by religious purification and a hunger strike, during which he watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy. For his last meal before execution, Gardner ordered steak, lobster tail, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream. Gardner's execution on June 18, 2010 was carried out by firing squad. 5 police officers aimed at the target drawn on Gardner's heart. One of the bullets was loaded with a wax bullet to conceal whose shot proved fatal. All of this was done to minimize psychological trauma for the officers carrying out the sentence. Gardner's body was handed over to his lawyers, cremated, and the ashes were scattered over water as the inmate had requested. The story of the execution of Turki Ibn Saud Al-Kabeer, a real Saudi prince, even shocked me, a lover of criminal stories. In 2012, at the age of just 11, Turki committed a crime by killing his friend, Adil ibn Suleiman ibn Abdul Karim al-Mahamid, during a fight. This event occurred in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. In this case, the legal process and the sentence strictly followed the norms of Sharia law. However, the victim's father refused to accept diya, in Islamic law, compensation for the crime, practically dooming Turki to execution despite his royal lineage. What further astonished me? Even King Salman ibn Abdul Aziz Al Saud, a relative of the prince, did not intervene to soften the sentence. On October 18, 2016, starting early in the morning, all the prescribed steps before the execution were completed. The prince wrote his will, performed the ritual ablution, and was transported to the mosque to participate in the Asr prayer, which is part of the Islamic rituals before execution. In the main square of Riyadh facing Mecca, Turki ibn Saud Al-Kabeer was made to kneel on a blue fabric. This moment, full of symbolism and religious significance, foreshadowed the end of his life. A Sharia guard officer handed the executioner a shamshir, a traditional Arab sword that became the instrument of execution. After the separation of the head from the body, a doctor approached to confirm the prince's death, after which the body was collected and taken to the cemetery for burial on the same day. Well, since I've started talking about unconventional executions, I must share these horrifying stories. Brothers Majid and Hussein Kavousifar were sentenced to death in 2007 for the murder of Judge Hassan Muqaddis. This judge was known for his cruelty and persecution of Iranian dissidents, which provoked dissatisfaction and an aggressive reaction from the Kavousifar brothers. The public execution of the brothers in Tehran was intended to demonstrate the severity of the Iranian judicial system and Sharia law, as well as their readiness to use the death penalty as a means of maintaining order in the country. Unlike the classical method of hanging, where death occurs quickly due to a cervical fracture, the Kavousifar brothers were hanged by the neck using a crane. This led to their slow and agonizing death by strangulation, lasting about 30 minutes. The bodies were not removed immediately, allowing everyone present to fully enjoy the spectacle. It was also unusual not to put black bags on the condemned, typically used in such cases to hide the faces of the dying from the public. In this case, the expressions on the faces of the Kavousifar brothers, their bulging eyes, and the protruding tongues were left visible to the crowd. The murderers' bodies were only buried the next day, and the burial site was kept secret. As promised at the very beginning, now about the execution of Timothy James McVeigh, one of the most notorious American terrorists, which caused a significant public outcry. He was sentenced to death for organizing and carrying out the bombing attack in Oklahoma City in 1995, resulting in the death of 168 people. It was one of the bloodiest terrorist attacks in the history of the United States until the events of September 11, 2001. McVeigh was executed on June 11, 2001 by lethal injection. Before the execution, he behaved calmly, ordered chocolate ice cream for breakfast, and declined to make a final statement. His execution was broadcast through television cameras, and among the spectators were relatives of the victims. If you think about it, McVeigh's life path was complex and contradictory. From childhood, he showed an interest in weapons and right-wing views, possibly influenced by his grandfather, a Michigan militia veteran. In school, he was an honor student and had a talent for programming, but in his youth, he rejected a future in the office, choosing military service. During his army service, especially during Operation Desert Storm, McVeigh faced the reality of war, killed several enemies, and was awarded for bravery. However, he encountered problems in the army due to his views, including an incident wearing a white t-shirt in protest against black t-shirts worn by black soldiers. This was interpreted as a manifestation of racism and led to disciplinary action. After the execution, relatives did not claim McVeigh's body and the lawyer was forced to cremate the terrorist. Executed bodies are usually not treated with ceremony, and in the vast majority of cases, they disappear ignominiously into the grounds or flames. However, sometimes there are exceptions. Thanks for watching.